Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Kia ora koutou, no mai haere mai. Good morning. Welcome to day 3 of SREcon. As Les said, my name's Karthik. I'm a coach within the Reliability Platform group at Canva. And before I get started, I wanted to give credit where it's due. This talk would not have been possible without the hard work and passion of my teammates within Canva's reliability teams and beyond. My role here is simply to be a narrator, a kind of David Attenborough character, here to guide you on a tour of reliability reviews in the wild. That's enough of that. What exactly do I mean by a reliability review? Well, the chances are that you've heard of it by some other name. Operations review, production meeting, service health check, service retro, or any number of other monikers, all based on the same basic idea: the process of reflecting on and planning to improve the health of a service. Now, to be clear, this is different to an incident review or a postmortem, if that's what you call it. I'll revisit that in a moment. It's also different to a typical team retro. Here, the aim is to focus on the continued operation of services that a particular team is responsible for. All right, but what's so wild about that? Well, while you can find some high-level guidance on this topic from various sources, in this talk, I aim to provide a more practical perspective through my team's own experiences in establishing and growing a review program at Canva. I'll frame it in terms of these 5 lessons. The first few focus more on the process, and the last few focus more on the technology that we built to support the process. The path that you take on your review program might vary based on the scale and scope that you decide to cover, but I think you'll be able to draw some parallels from the way our organization works to make these lessons relevant to you. The teams at Canva, and most likely in your organizations, each take ownership of one or more components or services that make up our product suite, by both building and ensuring the continued operation of those services in production. This build and run principle should be familiar to most of you attending this conference, and many of you may work in centralized enablement teams like mine, who provide guidance and platform tools to help these teams excel at maintaining the reliability of their services. Now, as we know, one of the founding features of a principled approach to reliability engineering is a focus on incident management, so that when incidents happen, we detect these quickly, coordinate a response effectively, and most importantly, learn from the experience. This is an important topic on its own, and actually was the focus of my earlier SREcon in 2018. But by design, this is typically an on-demand, interrupt-driven process. Now, the regular review practice allows us to layer an additional meta-analysis on top of these interrupt-driven processes. So on top of the on-demand post-incident reviews that we already run for each incident, our regular reliability reviews help us to summarize and reveal patterns across multiple incidents, or across multiple alerts, or across other events in a given time period relating to your service. These reviews could be focused on that individual team level, or they may even span multiple groups of teams and the associated services. But meta-analysis is just one reason for adopting a review practice. The second is that these regular reviews also help teams cover a broader range of aspects of their system's operation that they don't necessarily need to be interrupted about, but they still want to keep an eye on. And thirdly, and I think most importantly, reviews help teams to learn about their systems together, to transfer knowledge, to align on priorities, and ultimately to improve the resilience to future surprises. So this sounds like a good idea, right? But where do we start? What exactly should we be reviewing? Well, that brings me to our first lesson from the wild. Measure what matters. Now that sounds like a bit of a cop-out answer, but let me elaborate. I borrowed this phrase from the title of a book by John Doerr, and although that book deals with strategic planning rather than operational excellence, there are a couple of shared principles in the approach, such as those exemplified by these 2 quotes from the book. The first speaks to the principle of priority or importance, while the second speaks to the principle of objectivity or quantifiability. These 2 aspects, together with 2 other important ones, that is ownership and consistency, are in my opinions the keys to providing clarity to teams on what they should care about reviewing. But at the outset, the key principle is priority. What matters most in your organization? To draw from our own experience, we've been guided by these 3 thematic questions. 1, are our services meeting their defined service level objectives? SLOs fit really neatly into this framework. 2, have we taken the opportunity to learn and improve from incidents? Wording is important there. And 3, are we effectively managing our engineers' workload and well-being when they're on call? For us, our vision and strategy for reliability aligns very closely with these 3 themes. And I'd recommend hashing out a narrative or a strategy like this in your own case to guide you in this process. And actually, in your organization's case, this may even extend to aspects that may not just fall under the scope of reliability, such as those shown here. And that's why these sometimes get talked about as operational reviews rather than just reliability reviews. But this is a reliability conference, so I'm going to talk about reliability. We found, though, that just 2 or 3 key themes are plenty. So I encourage you to be brutal in your prioritization, because in the coming sections, you'll hopefully see the compounding effect of biting off more than you can chew. Now, although measurement provides a solid foundation for a review practice, depending on the measures you choose or the way you frame these questions, there could be potential to provoke unintended behavior or misinterpretation. So you need to choose wisely. I've noticed today that the closing talk is going to touch on reasons to avoid these first 2 metrics. So I won't say much more other than you should understand why these measures are misleading, and be prepared to explain that to others in your organization who may not be so informed. The third example, though, is one where context and framing is important. While we choose to measure unacknowledged alerts as a way to identify alert noise, this could be misconstrued as a way to blame individuals for not paying attention to their pager, which is totally not the intention. So we must take care to convey our intention clearly. Okay, so the next lesson, in the words of the Scouts in Disney's The Lion King, is be prepared. As with anything, the first question is where to begin. Why not start with the basics? While you shouldn't expect stellar results, the do-it-yourself or DIY approach can be an enlightening first step before you dive into developing tools to increase clarity. This is exactly how we started over the first few months of our program. Now, these timeline slides, which you'll see a few times, aren't an indication of the effort we spent on any particular phase, but more an indication of how long we let each phase soak in. Indeed, for this first phase, there was very little effort required on our part at all, because the aim here is just to publish some basic guidance for teams outlining answers to these questions. What should we review? That's where those thematic questions come in. Who should be involved? When should we meet? How often and how much time should we be setting aside for these? And how should teams gather insights for review, pointing them at some of the existing tools that exist in your organization, in your platform? Now, this last point is something that I'm just going to talk about for a little bit. How should teams take notes and track actions that arise from these meetings? In our case, we found that we could just create a template page on our wiki to enable this practice. And for teams, it typically works best if those actions are tracked as tickets on their own backlogs or their similar workflow system. That way, those actions can be managed alongside other work. Action management is sort of a topic on its own and somewhat controversial, so I won't spend much more time on that in this talk. Now, as I said before, you shouldn't expect stellar results from this. After all, you're basically asking busy teams to do a bit more work. As a result, you'll see some patchy adoption. Having said that, we were quite surprised with the number of teams that were able to establish some sort of review practice just with these basic templates. Those teams that do engage will likely have some power users that have some prior experience in this type of activity, or teams with a particular pain point that requires their urgent attention. In both cases, you should actively seek feedback from these teams to help you validate your assumptions and refine your approach. The chief challenge with this approach, though, is that where we want answers from two different systems, disparate systems, things start to become impractical quite quickly. In our experience, where we have multiple third-party tools with widely different filtering, transformation, and visualization capabilities, teams just tend to concentrate on their most capable tool, which often just ends up being their observability tool. And they'll perform a service level style analysis, which aligns with our first thematic question. So it's a good start, but it still leaves some blind spots around some of the measures that we still think matter. What we'd prefer is a system that automatically crunches all of the data from these disparate systems and provides clear insights across each of the measures that matter, which are relevant to the teams and the time period that they want to review. But such a system will take some time to develop. We found, though, that in order to help us to continue to drive engagement in the practice and further refine our insights, we needed an intermediate step. And that brings me to the third lesson from the wild: pace yourself. The intermediate step that we employed was to take advantage of the expertise within our reliability engineering team to run targeted facilitated reviews. Because we were able to draw our facilitators from the same teams that were tasked with building the review tools, this connected them directly with the people that could benefit from those tools, connecting developers to customers. It also motivated development of the tools by reducing the toil required to prepare for reviews. That's because at this point, the tooling is still in development and requires some additional wrangling by the facilitator before presenting for review. With the facilitator focusing on pulling this together ahead of the meeting, it means the meeting itself can focus on a more interactive discussion about what to do about those pre-compiled insights. More than that, the facilitation allows us to give the review content to reviews for pre-reading, which is actually really important. I'll come back to that in a moment. But because of the extra effort required to prepare, we needed to ensure the areas we targeted for facilitation provided us with the most value. So we found we could achieve that by engaging with senior engineering leaders rather than with the teams directly, and facilitating broad reviews of all of the teams and services that they were accountable for. Now, this top-down approach helps those group leaders to prime the teams and raise awareness of the practice so that when our self-service reporting tool becomes ready, it will help to increase adoption of that. We split this part of our program across 2 phases, following on from that DIY phase. In phase 2, we organized reviews with just a couple of groups, expanding to just a few more by the end of that phase. We designed presentation templates, wrote playbooks, and made it easier to prepare for those reviews. And as we gained experience preparing and presenting the reviews, we started to form a design of the reporting tools that we wanted to build in future. Now, something quite important to touch on at this point is that it's quite natural to find these group review sessions somewhat confronting. And that's both for the facilitators and for the reviewees. So we need to take steps to address that anxiety. I'm not going to go through this whole list, as some of the points I've already covered, but 2 points in particular are worth calling out. I mentioned earlier about the need to produce the review data ahead of the meeting for pre-reading. For reviews at group level, where it could be months between consecutive reviews because of scheduling challenges, this becomes particularly important. When the reviewees have had a chance to see the data that's going to be presented in advance and discuss it with their teams, it leads to a deeper discussion about the blockers and conflicting priorities that are really challenging those teams. And the good news is you have all the people in the room that you need to be able to unblock those challenges. In phase 3, we tried to instill these practices into a larger group of facilitators so that we could aim to cover all top-level engineering groups, which we call supergroups, at Canva. I should point out that in your own journey, you might want to more gradually build up to covering more groups. For us, since we were a relatively new group in the company, it made sense to scale out quickly to help strengthen our network within Canva by connecting more closely with our internal clients. But throughout this phase, we developed our tooling to a point where the key content for each group could be extracted in just a few minutes on average, and allows more time for those facilitators to sort of add their own editorial finesse to these reviews. So now let's look at how this tooling took shape. And the recurrent theme in our development of the review platform was reduce, reuse, recycle. Now, we saw before that to get to the measures that matter, we might need to dig into data from multiple systems while the user experience between these systems can vary wildly. But their APIs tend to be more tame. There are two systems of record highlighted in green here that serve a particular critical purpose, which we'll come back to in lesson 5. The biggest way in which we managed to reduce our effort to set up and run this platform was to take advantage of our in-house data analytics platform. Now, that might seem like cheating to you, but in recent times, I've observed more and more organizations are investing in a similar managed data warehouse and reporting platforms, typically to support their in-house product data analytics and emerging data science teams. Now, in our case, I believe we were the first team outside of product analytics to take up residence in our data warehouse, though a few other teams from our group were quick to follow in our footsteps. So this is something I encourage you to look into in your own organizations. It is possible to do this without such a managed data platform, but it's going to take you a little bit longer. We also found that we were able to recycle some tools built in those earlier phases, which would previously been used to pull data out of our source systems. In most cases, these tools could be stripped down to their bare essentials, acting essentially like API scrapers, with all the data conversion and transformation functionality removed and pushed into the data warehouse instead. It also meant that common scraper logic, such as client resilience and credential storage and instrumentation, could be refactored into a shared module. The raw data produced by each of these extractors gets ingested into the warehouse on demand by the data platform's inbuilt bulk loading process. And that leaves us free to concentrate more on that transform stage, where we partition the schema into 3 layers. The first one being to segregate the data by source following ingestion. The second one being to do all that magic of field manipulation, data type conversion, and joining the different data sets together. And that third publish layer provides us with a way to offload complex query logic that we may initially develop to visualize this data. Now that's important because one of the drawbacks of this, using a data platform such as this, is that the automation around change is not quite up to the same standard as you might have in the rest of your software stack. And that's something that's still maturing. So that's something to consider while you go into this, and especially where you need to collaborate, where multiple engineers need to collaborate on building out this solution. Now, as I said, we started the development of the solution back in the earlier phases to help our facilitators prepare for their group level reviews. And by the 4th phase, we built this out, but we returned our focus back to those individual teams, and we trialed this new self-service solution in workshops with a few early adopters. We've recently just launched our first version of this, which also obviously means we've been eating our own dog food and incorporating some sound reliability practices into supporting this solution. Before I wrap things up, I just want to touch on one last lesson concerning ownership. One of the key elements of our self-service system are these interactive filters at the top. Users manipulate these to produce the insights that are relevant to their review. To be able to do this effectively, we need a way to tie each entity we're reporting on to the entity that's responsible for it, or the owner. So obviously we need to ingest another data source that holds these mappings, right? Unfortunately for us, and I suspect for some of you as well, such a data source didn't exist at the outset of our journey, or at least no canonical data source existed. So to illustrate what's going on in the hood, this is a hypothetical diagram that shows the various references that might need to be navigated to retrieve, let's say, alerts and incidents relevant to a particular group. If any of the individual mappings are inaccurate, this could have a major impact on the relevancy of results. Now, in my observations, typically the mappings or coupling between entities we report on and their associated services is not really a problem. The real challenge lies in the mappings between services and their owners. And interestingly, there are multiple systems out there that try to do this mapping, but all of them, whether they're source code, monitoring systems, on-call management, or even initial attempts at a component catalog, all of them are inconsistent. Well, they're not consistent with each other, and all of them are incomplete. And so when we're trying to report across teams across the whole organization, that's just not going to cut it for us. As you've probably worked out by now, I love breaking things down into steps so that we don't have to climb that mountain at once. So in our case, back in the first phases of this program, where we realized the gravity of this issue, we set about piecing together a more complete issue of this service ownership from the information available in the various source systems. We picked tiebreakers for those inconsistencies, and where there wasn't enough information to tie a service to a team, we at least were able to tie it to a group of teams. And then we just asked those teams to fill in any gaps and correct those inaccuracies. Now, there's a few extra levels we can take this to, and I'm happy to talk about some of these in questions afterwards. But to quickly wrap things up, these are our 5 lessons from the wild which we wanted to impart to you. I think the key theme here to take away is don't try to bite off more than you can chew, because there's a lot to be learned from just starting out with the basics. And as you progress through these steps, you'll be able to take advantage of some of the tools that yourself or maybe even others in your organization have built, and then just strip those down and reuse and recycle them to build out your tooling platform. Finally, ownership is not a problem that you can avoid here, especially when you're reporting across the organization as a whole. So you need to fix that who owns this problem that might have been lurking in the back of your mind to be able to deal with this effectively. Thanks very much, everyone, and yeah, we'll happy to take questions.